good morning, good evening, everyone. Thank you very much and welcome to our webinar today. Thank you to SPIA for the invitation. My name is Hambulo Ngoma. I'm an agricultural economist working for the International Maize and Wheat Improvement Center based at the Southern Africa Region Office in Harare. So today I'm going to talk to you about some of our work in a project in Zambia on adoption, diffusion, and impacts of sustainable intensification practices in maize-based smallholder farming systems. So maybe before I jump in, I just wanted to maybe clarify a few terms. So by adoption here, we're basically looking at the uptake of these specific intensification practices. And in a bit, I'm going to explain what these intensification practices are. And by diffusion, we're looking at the extent to which the practices that are being promoted by the project are being used by some of the participants in the project outside of the project supported plots. And it could also mean the extent to which these intensification practices are being used outside of the areas where the project operates, or outside of the farms of farmers that are direct beneficiaries of the project. So basically that will be my talk today. So I have an outline. I will say a little bit about the project. I must say this is a project led by colleagues in CIMMYT, some agronomist colleagues in CIMMYT. So I'm not very qualified to say a lot about that project because I'm not an agronomist myself, but I'll say a bit of background so that you see the angle from which our socioeconomics work comes in. And then I'm going to say a little bit more about what we are doing in the socioeconomics unit of the project, which is the unit that I'm affiliated with. I'll talk a little bit about our methods and approaches to addressing some of the key questions that are of interest to the project. I'll say a little bit about what we've done so far and what we plan to do going forward. So I don't intend to show any results, but it's more to talk about the processes and approaches. And I think feedback on that would be very helpful for us in the group. So now let's jump in and let me say a little bit about the project. So the CIFAS project in full stands for Sustainable Intensification of Farming Systems among smallholder farmers in Zambia. What I show here is an intervention logic. So basically showing you the three different components of the project. There's on the left side, the adaptive research component, which basically develops or co-develops different technologies with farmers and conducts a lot of agronomic research using specific approaches, which I'll come into. The middle part is the promotion side of things. So think of technologies that have been developed on the adaptive side and they've been proven to work. They're now sent to the second stage, which is the promotion, where now these proved technologies are promoted to the wider audience of smallholder farmers in Zambia. The third arm of the project is the enabling environment. So in this presentation, I don't intend to cover the last two parts. I'll focus more on the adaptive research. And so basically on the adaptive research, the project uses a baby and mother approach. So there's a number of mother trials that are set up to basically do research on a number of intensification practices in the project areas, which I'll show in the next slide. And so the idea with the mother trials is you have a farmer that accepts to participate in the project as a mother host farmer, and then they host a trial which has probably 6 to 10 plots, and on each plot there are different intensification technologies or practices that are being tried. So you have a number of these mother host trials per research cluster, and I'm going to show the research clusters in the next slide. And so the idea is once these different sustainable intensification practices on display on the mother trial host plots, then people around would come and see what is there, learn, pick what they want to try on. And those that pick on some specific technologies are what I refer to as baby trial hosts. So, and hence the term mother and baby. So you have the mothers that have 6 to 10 different technologies, of course, with some controls. And then babies can choose different technologies of their liking. Maybe one, they go and try it in their own space. So our socioeconomic work is embedded under this adaptive research. And I'm going to say a little bit about what exactly we're hoping to do. So just to continue and give you a bit more context about the project. So the project is implemented in 3 distinct regions of Zambia. So what you see there is the yellow parts, that's the high rainfall areas. You have the other areas in blue or green. I'm not very good at colors. So that's in the high rainfall areas basically receive more than 1,000 millimeters annually. The other areas receive between 800 and 1,000, but then they are segmented depending on the soil type. On the other side, what you see there are just numbers of the targets and everything. But then a little bit more about the mother and baby trial approach that I was talking about. So on the far left there, what you see is, think of that like as a research cluster. Oh, somehow I got muted, but can you hear me now?
You're good. You're good now.
Okay.
It was just very, very short. You're good.
Okay, yeah. So what you see on the top left there is a research cluster. And the green boxes that you see there would be exactly what I was describing as the mother host farmers, the mother host trial, or the mother trials, if you like. And like I said, the mother trial will have a number of technologies, sometimes 6, sometimes 8, sometimes 10, and even more. When you come in the middle part there, so think of this green box now, it's enlarged to show you that it has the different technologies that are being promoted, that are being researched on and tried by the project. So this is this middle part here that you see. And the small arrows around the middle part that shows the different breakaway parts, those would be now the babies, the baby trials, which are picked from the mothers by different farmers to go and try in their own farms. So usually baby host farmers would probably pick one technology. Sometimes they'll pick 2, at the most, I think 2, maybe 3. But I've seen people pick 1 technology, or people pick at least 2, and then they go and try on their own. So just a bit more context again. So the mother trial hosts, or the mother trials, this is really where the researchers, the agronomists in the project are doing their research on these mother trial hosts. So think of the mother hosts or the mother trials as farmer managed or farmer implemented and researcher managed trials. But when you go to the babies are more an initiative of the farmer who's seen something that they think might be useful, and they pick that and say they want to try it on their own. Maybe they think that the technology is good enough or not. And so because of that, logically, the mother trials are set up first, and then the babies come in the second, because they have to see before they can actually try something. And so at the mother host, again, there are a lot of activities that happen, exposure activities. Farmers meet there to learn of the different technologies. There are different evaluations they do. They evaluate the different technologies based on a whole number of things. For example, the evaluations are divided into 3 stages. There's the early stage evaluation where they're looking at the crop vigor, the color, the emergency, and then there's the mid-season where they're looking at the way the crop is being established. And then there's the late one where they're looking at now the cob formation in case of maize and all those kind of things that our agronomy friends are very good at. So this is basically the context of the project. Basically using on the adaptive research side of things, mother trials and baby trials, like I mentioned. So
Could
now
I just ask a
can,
quick, sorry, just to clarify really quickly, is that okay?
Yeah.
The researcher selects the technologies on the mother trial, is that right?
Well, so the technologies on the mother trials are co-developed by researchers and farmers. So it's an iterative process. And remember, this is not the first project to have ever been done. So there's some lessons from past projects. There's some technologies that are developed based on the current production challenges or productivity challenges and sustainability challenges in the smallholder farming systems. So the identification of the technologies is done collaboratively under this adaptive research component that I talked about.
Thanks.
Thank you. And so just to some icing to my talk about the project. So basically the project aims to improve productivity, economic and ecological sustainability of smallholder farming systems. In a nutshell, the project is looking at reducing poverty, farm incomes, and improving livelihoods of smallholder farmers, and also building the resilience of these smallholder farmers to emerging shocks such as climate change and all. So now let me jump into exactly what we're doing under the socioeconomics work of the project. So in the socioeconomic component of the project, we're basically interested in 2 or 3 things. The first part is to try and understand why, despite several years of investments, the uptake of some of these intensification practices is lower than expected. In some instances, there's actually lack of adoption. And so that's one very big component we're interested in. The second part is what can be done about the seemingly low or non-adoption. And the third component is concerned with the impact, evaluating the impact of these sustainable intensification practices. Could it be the reason that the returns to these practices is lower, and that's the reason why you have low adoption, or what? So now I'll just go in a bit of details. So on the adoption side of things and on the diffusion side of things, we're basically interested in assessing the extent of adoption and the extent of diffusion of these sustainable intensification practices, what I now term as SIPs. And in doing that, we're interested in both the intensive and the extensive margin. So on the intensive margin, you're looking at how much cultivated land is allocated to each of these sustainable intensification practices. And I'll come to these intensification practices and give you examples just in a bit. So on the intensive part, we're looking at how much of the cultivated land is allocated to these different intensification practices. And on the extensive margin, we're looking at what proportion of farmers in a district, in an agricultural camp, or whatever geographical unit or administrative unit you can think of, are using these intensification practices. And then within the adoption work, we're interested in trying to make a distinction between true adoption and trial or experiment adoption. So question is, what is true adoption and what is trial or experiment adoption? So in our view, true adoption would be the kind of uptake of these practices that farmers do on their own without having external support. Whereas trial adoption would be the kind of adoption you see in an early stage where a farmer has just been introduced to something and they're still trying to evaluate. And in that period, in some instances, some farmers then would get some support to enable them to implement some of those practices. And so that's where we're trying to make the distinction. We're also interested to look at within farm diffusion and across farm diffusion. So within farm diffusion, think of a mother trial host farmer, for example. they have 6 to 10 plots on their farm that are dedicated for research on this project. Those plots receive some form of support to enable them implement the different technologies that the project is promoting or the project is researching on. And so within farm diffusion then would be, to what extent do these, for example, mother host farmers use some of these sustainable intensification practices on other plots other than the plots that are supported by this particular project, and for that matter, several other projects. Because as you know, in development, there's no particular one area where you only find one project. At a time, you have quite a number of projects operating in similar geographical zones and promoting similar things. And then the across farm diffusion looks at more what happens across outside of these direct beneficiaries of the project. Are some of these sustainable intensification practices that are promoted by the project being used by farmers that are not direct beneficiaries of the project within the vicinity of, for example, the mother trial host farmers? So that is what we mean by saying across farm diffusion. The second part, like I said, dwells more on the impact assessment. And there are a range of outcomes, as I said, looking at the objectives of the project. There's an interest on productivity, both looking at land and labor productivity. We have a number of sustainable intensification practices that are being promoted by the project. So one of the interesting questions there is to look at the differential land productivity effects of the different intensification practices and the labor aspect. As you know, labor has been one of the most oft-cited impediments to the uptake of some of these intensification practices. So do we see any differences across the different SIPs? Of course, there's an interest to improve the livelihoods of the smallholder farmers, reduce poverty, improve food security, improve nutrition security, and that's also an outcome of interest. And also, there's an interest to raise farm incomes and build the resilience of these smallholder farmers. So, I keep talking about sustainable intensification practices from 18 minutes now. So, these include a range of practices such as conservation agriculture, rotation, cereal legume rotation to be precise, mulching, which is basically the in situ living of crop residues that are then incorporated into the following season, the intercropping, the different weed control strategies. So the project has a number of these sustainable intensification practices under each of these broad themes that I've put up there. So there's quite a lot of them that are being tried under the adaptive research component of the project. So now let me turn to the methods and approaches just a little bit. So in terms of data collection, we're basically using both qualitative and quantitative. On the quantitative side of things, we're using a household survey, and the interest there is to answer the what, how much questions. And so I'll talk a little bit about the details of the survey that we're doing. On the qualitative side of things, I remember I said one of the interests in the socioeconomics unit is to look at adoption and diffusion dynamics. Often it's not the easiest thing to answer such questions using quantitative data. So we bring in some aspect of qualitative data, which we hope will help us answer the why and how questions. If these practices are indeed good, why are farmers not picking them up? Or how can farmers be nudged to take more of these practices? So for the quantitative survey, we're using a household questionnaire, which has quite a number of modules. I just want to bring your attention to module 2, if you like, on farm, which collects very detailed information on farm characteristics, on adoption and diffusion dynamics. and that is done at a plot level. Because remember, from my initial discussion, I said the adaptive research in this project is built around mother trials and baby trials. And within mother trials, you have a number of plots. So for us to be able to capture the dynamics very well, we have a very detailed section on farm characteristics, on adoption and dynamics. So in terms of the sample design itself, like I said, for the qualitative part, we're using focus group discussions. And in the first wave, which is this year, we did 2 focus group discussions per agricultural camp, and our research is being done, the adaptive research is being done in 18 agricultural camps spread across 9 districts and 3 provinces of Zambia. And we aim to do 2 key informant interviews per agricultural camp. On the quantitative survey, we thought of building up a panel, a 2-wave panel, to help us answer some of those key questions around the outcomes of interest. So we designed our sample based on the budget, available budget, and other consideration to include at least 50% of the host farmers. So the host farmers, remember, these are mother trial host farmers and baby trial host farmers. And the other 50% was just some other farmers who are not host farmers. So for the host farmers, remember in my initial talk, I said there are 6 to 8 mother trial host farmers per camp, per research cluster. So we decided to include all of those, but then we have about 3,000 baby host farmers from all the research areas. And we decided to randomly select the difference to make sure that out of the total sample, we have 50% host farmers and the other 50% is other farmers. For the other farmers, we made sure to get sampling frames of farmers that are within a 10 to 20 kilometer radius of the mother host farmers, because we thought those are farmers where there's a high likelihood that they interacted with the mother host farmers. Once we had the sampling frame that was obtained through the agriculture extension officers and the village heads for the selected villages where the research is being done, we then randomly selected. So the total sample is about 678 households. Half of that are host farmers, half of that are just other farmers. So just some pictures
you have
from
about,
the first.
Just sorry to interrupt. You have about 7-8 minutes. Just
thank
to let you know.
So, yeah, thank you. So this is just some pictures of what happened. You know, we had the usual training. You know, with COVID, it was a bit of a challenge, but we managed to do something here in the field, all masked up and sanitizers and all that. That was during the first wave. So what have we done so far? Like I said, so far we've done fieldwork in all the 18 research camps in 9 districts and 3 provinces of Zambia. We've done 336 focus group discussions with about 282 participants. So in each camp, we're doing 1 focus group discussion for men and another one for women, you know, to cater for the dynamics that might be there. And for the household survey, like I said, we managed to interview 678 households in 2021. And we're planning to do the second wave just after the harvest season in 2022. And this map just gives us an indication of where it is. I showed the similar map earlier on, so this is just for emphasis. So what are the next steps as I conclude? Okay, so for the next steps, like I mentioned, again, we'll go back to the initial work plan, more or less, that we have as socioeconomics. We have intentions to do more work on adoption and diffusion dynamics, taking into account all the different categorizations that I talked about. The beauty here is that we're going to have a 2-wave panel data set. Of course, the interval between the first and the second is quite tight, but we hope we can see some interesting movements. And also, we're also interested in answering the question about what can be done to nudge adoption and diffusion. I mean, if these practices are good, I mean, we have evidence from way back showing how these practices are beneficial in so many different ways. So question is not so much around how good they are, but what can be done to kind of nudge adoption in our view. The other part, of course, it's on the impacts of these sustainable intensification practices on a range of outcomes. Like I mentioned, the productivity outcomes, think about yield, land productivity, if you like, think about labor productivity, think about a whole broad range on livelihoods, incomes, farm incomes, nutrition security, food security. So even in the survey, I must mention, we have modules that capture some aspects of food security, using the household hunger experience scale, household hunger score. And then we also have some modules on nutrition aspects using the household dietary diversity score. So for this particular one, we're hoping to leverage on the panel structure of the data that we're building up so that we can be able to control some of the confounders, some of the unobserved heterogeneity that interact with farm abilities in some ways and lead to endogeneity. And we're hoping we can combine some IV approaches, instrumental variable approaches, with this panel data to assess also the distribution effects, because most of the time when you think about impact, you're thinking about what is the impact at the mean. But smallholder farmers are not a homogeneous group. They're quite different. So the distribution aspects of this impact becomes very, very, very important. And there was a baseline survey that was done some time back, even before I joined the project. So we're thinking about how we can leverage that larger baseline survey with the current data to answer some of the key questions that we have. And with that, I'm done. Thank you very much to SPIA for the invite, and thanks to everybody. Happy to take questions. Thank you.
Okay, I think the plan is we go straight to Sujata. Is that right? I think. Yes. Okay, great. So
I can stop sharing.
Yeah.
Should I stop? Okay.
Yeah, and then Sujata will.
Thanks. I'm trying to figure out how to share. Let me see.
Yeah, I think it's open share tray, if that isn't confusing enough terminology. I believe there's a little arrow, up arrow on the box with an up arrow on it. I think you can open that one, but
so okay, and then do I have to browse my computer?
I think if you click open share tray, then you pick which screen you want to share. It pops up the different screens, and you pick the screen that you'd like to share.
Open share tray. I am not seeing something called, oh, maybe this is it.
The up arrow thing.
Yes. Do you see it now?
Yes.
Great, thank you. Thanks. So thank you for this talk, Hambulo. I learned a lot from even just listening to you. So that was really helpful. Some of what I say, I have other things I thought about as I was listening to you, so I might add on if there's time, a few more questions that I have for you. But jumping right in, when I read your slides, it said, obviously, the concern that you have in terms of being able to assess the impact or even just the adoption causally is that there is a self-selection problem into farmers who choose to adopt these technologies might be different from farmers who choose not to, and there is endogeneity there because people who expect to benefit will obviously, we think, be more likely to adopt it, right? And you mentioned that the panel structure you're hoping will allow you to solve this endogeneity problem. And so perhaps what you're thinking about is using household fixed effects or something like that. But of course, there is still going to be the issue that households that expect to benefit more might be the ones that adopt, right? So that, you know, at the same time that they are adopting, they might be doing other things, so that it's not just, it's not necessarily a time invariant characteristic of the household that is causing better outcomes for these households, but there might be other things that are changing at the same time. So it's just a standard problem that we often run into when we're trying to use household fixed effects. You also mentioned using an instrumental variable, so I was curious to find out from you if you had any thoughts about what that instrumental variable could be. And obviously, the more background information we have about the project itself, institutional details will make it easier for us to understand what could possibly be used as an instrumental variable. So things like implementation, the incentives that farmers had to take up these technologies, those could have been explicitly offered by the project. But then when you're talking about adoption, you know, on plots that are not the experimental or the project plots, and then other farmers who are not project participants also taking it on, then you also want to think about what are their own incentives to take this on. And if we understand this, then we might be able to think about what are the barriers to adoption, and things like that might help us to think about what kind of instrumental variable one might be able to come up with. Timing of rollout of these technologies is an obvious one. So knowing how the CFAS project decided to roll these things out could be really helpful. And the sources for this kind of information would obviously come from project documentation or institutional knowledge that people might have in the places where you're working, and your own field work. So I thought it was really interesting that you have done qualitative work already. And so it would be nice if you could tell us more about what the qualitative work is showing you, and then, you know, maybe analyzing and tabulating the data that you have so far to see how adopters, I think you mentioned in your slides that there are also disadopters, so them and non-adopters, how do they differ from each other? What are the reasons that they state in your qualitative work for adopting, not adopting, and so on? And then try and think about variation that could be what we call plausibly exogenous, right? So for example, if the program has been rolled out in a staggered fashion, because of some constraints, such as, for example, administrative constraints or budget constraints or something like that, that are not correlated with the farmer's behaviors or characteristics. Other reasons why there could be plausibly exogenous variation is if some technology requires you to have a minimum plot size or a minimum amount of land, a particular soil quality, terrain, you know, there is probably in the technology something one can learn that might help us figure out these things that we could then argue are plausibly exogenous, because it's difficult, let's say, for a farmer to change some of these things just because this project is now being conducted in their village. And so the idea behind it being plausibly exogenous would be that it would be something that could not have, I mean, for you to use it as an instrumental variable, it would need to have affected the farmer's productivity and incomes, not directly, right, but only through their adoption of these technologies. So that's the kind of thing that you're probably going to have to look for. And actually, I'm just turning it back to you to see if you have anything to add to your presentation where you can give us some insights into something like this that could be used. That's all I have.
Great.
I had a few other questions, but I can come back to them later. Just new thoughts I had after listening to him. But Kyle, I can hold on.
Okay, then Hambulo, do you want to just briefly respond to a couple things that Sujata mentioned there, particularly on what your thoughts are on what you can do empirically in terms of the instrument and empirical strategies moving forward? Then we'll open it for a discussion.
Sure.
I can stop sharing if I can figure that out. Sorry. Go ahead. Stop sharing. Yeah.
Yeah. Well.
Okay.
Okay. Go ahead, Hambulo.
Okay. Thank you very much, Sujata, for those very, very enlightening, very precise comments. I mean, we run into these kinds of problems almost all the time when we're looking at when you're doing some work on adoption and thinking about doing impact assessment. Of course, the issue about using panel data and household fixed effects, yes, there'll always be other things that are not time invariant. Is that me, or are you hearing me okay?
Yeah, you're good.
Okay. Yeah, so my thinking is that, of course, we leverage on the panel structure of the data to deal with the time invariant, but also to the extent that we can also then control for the many observables that we can. And I've been particularly thinking about, I've been thinking about, exploring ways of combining this panel structure of the data with some instrumental variable approaches to help us deal with the self-selection that you mentioned, Sujata, which is very much an issue. But also I should have added that for the impact assessment work, because then we have these farmers that were supported by the project, we're thinking of just trying to focus on use of these particular technologies on plots that are not supported by the project. So that, again, we're kind of trying to reduce the contamination from the project activities. Your interventions around institutional background, how the project was rolled out, was it staggered, was it a one-off thing? I think those are very interesting and insightful points that you raise. And of course, there are a few things that we could learn from there. So the rollout was not staggered. The project started off at once. But then there was a lot of background work in selecting the places. Like I mentioned earlier on, the project is implemented on a gradient that differs across the agroecological zones. But when you go down to the research clusters themselves, farmers should have had some acceptable sizes for them to be able to host the mother trial. That's one part. Yeah, the qualitative data so far is highlighting quite a few things that are of interest, but whether we can argue that there's some institutional arrangement that can, plausibly be argued to be exogenous, it's something that we still have to give thoughts to. But more in terms of the instruments, when you look through literature, a lot of the instruments that have been used and that we've also found to be useful are things related to access to information about these particular practices, the social capital variables, relationships to, for example, the village heads, the chiefs, whether you have, for example, a local member of parliament, a serving local member of parliament, a guy who comes from your area, that is thought to have the capacity to influence how your area is looked at in terms of the different development interventions. So this would be my quick thoughts, and I'd really appreciate if you can share that PowerPoint with me so that even as we go on with this work, we can think a lot more carefully about some of these things. Thank you. Over, Chair.
Thanks. I think, Sujata, you may have some responses to some of those things, but maybe let's weave those in with a sort of general discussion, if that's okay. My one suggestion would be we often, when we do these, we say, look, we collect a survey and we sort of start from the bottom and try and find some plausibly exogenous source of variation and so on. I think it makes sense instead to start from the top and start from like the very beginning of when the program was carried out and try and understand I think Sujata is saying all this stuff, I'm just putting it in different words, trying to understand all the little mechanics about how the choices were made about where the program was done, not just at the farm level, but all the way up above that, because that's where you might find some of the interesting variation that Sujata was mentioning, particularly the land size thing that you mentioned, and so on. So that would be my suggestion on that. But let's move to a general discussion. Both Karen and Rashid have their hands up. Karen, why don't you go?
Sure. Thanks, Kyle, and thanks, Hambulo, for the presentation, and for taking up the invitation. Indeed. So, can I ask you first a very quick clarification question, which is: so how long has how long have the trials been going on?
This is the third year.
The third year, okay. And so you have a first data that you collected at the beginning of the third year, and then you'll do another data collection in a year or so. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct.
And then the data that you collected the data on is not a panel with the baseline, with the larger baseline data.
No, so the larger baseline is not a panel with the one we are collecting now, because the larger baseline, maybe let me back off a little bit. So the project is operating in quite a number of places. I think 27 districts, if I remember well. But out of those 27 districts, they are 9 districts. I don't know if Christian is on the call. He might be able to correct me if I've misrepresented him. But the point is the adaptive research work is not being done in all the areas where the project operates. There are different activities that happen in the other areas. So the baseline was done in all those other places, and even I think some additional. But then our survey is just basically done in the places where the adaptive research is happening.
Okay, and so I mean it may be not feasible, but it's like, if at least in the areas where you have your research, it'd be useful to see whether some of these are the same farmers, and whether you de facto have 3 rounds. I guess the other kind of general observation here is that which is true for a lot of impact assessment in CGR. So that's why I want to make the point, is that we in addition to the concerns of endogeneity and needing to think of an instrument before you start, not after you started, there is also the point of being way too ambitious about the types of outcomes that you are trying to measure impact on. But so this is, so if you're a farmer in the mother trial, you know, maybe that's a big shock to you, because you have, you know, that's a relatively large plot of land, but those are particularly hard to find counterfactuals for, right? So the people that are selected for the mother trial. So that's a particularly hard kind of one to lift. The baby trial ones, you know, depending on what you'll figure out about how those people get selected or self-select, that may be easier, but then they probably also, for them, the shock is relatively small, right? So kind of they get to test this 1 or 2 technologies on a small piece of their land. And so it's not clear that it's credible, or that we should expect, I guess is what I really want to say, that we should expect impacts on food security or income or any of those outcomes. And so now I know you already collected the data on it in the first round, but even so, I kind of wonder whether the richness here is not in the disadoption type of story that you're after, and having potentially higher frequency data on some of those, instead of collecting, so, you know, trying to kind of collect data on these outcomes that you shouldn't expect to change over the short period of time, even if you were able to identify it. So there's kind of a design choice there to be made. So that kind of, you know, very often we're trying to do too much, and then by trying to do too much, there is very little we can do in a credible way. And so I guess that's something to consider.
Thanks, Karen. Yeah, sorry, it took me a while to come off mute. I'm pretty much an amateur at Teams. Rashid, go ahead, and then Hambulo, if you want to react to those questions jointly. And then, okay, Rashid, go ahead.
Okay, yeah, maybe it's good that it goes together because it's very related. I had many similar points in mind. So one was understanding this baseline, and so with this sort of fixed effects approach, if there is no baseline, then I'm not sure your you're solving the problem. Because if you have multiple rounds, but all of them are after the treatment started, then you're not controlling for any things that happened. I mean, the ideal thing is you have fixed effects, but you also have before and after the treatment started. And if you don't have this, it seems like it's unlikely that by chance you have sufficient sample size between the initial sample and the one that comes in the 2 rounds afterwards, the baseline and the 2 rounds that you have. If you have it, that would be very helpful indeed, but that's probably a limitation. I also found very interesting the you called it the experimenting versus true adoption, and I also think there is something that's quite interesting there, and it's very interesting to look at this dynamic and whether they over time keep using it even when it's not supported, whether they use it in other places, and how that happens. Well, Karen and I are working in similar things, so maybe that's also why we find these things interesting. But definitely maybe your survey can also expand on this. Now on your sampling frame, so you have this argument that there may be strong spillovers across farmers. But then it's not clear to me whether these set of farmers that are not sort of treated directly, is that for you see, putting aside all the problems of endogeneity that have been mentioned, that of course are difficult to deal with, but would this group be a control or it's the spillover group? And that's where, or maybe you can play a bit with the distance for if you're in that group but close enough, you're potentially a spillover group versus if you're in that group, because 10 to 20 kilometers seems pretty large to me, and that could easily include people that were not really exposed very much. But so you have this additional problem of it's not necessarily I mean it's not clear whether you see them as counterfactual or exposed, or the counterfactual or the spillover group. Now, maybe, and we need to know something about the technology, is it a completely new technology? So if kind of the baseline says there is almost no one using it initially, and then the project starts and you see some take up, and then there is some take up also happening in other plots, etc., it puts you in a better position, because you can say, well, sort of the counterfactual that one has in mind is zero use because almost no one was using it, and then anything that is seen on the other plots over time in neighbors that were not participating to the treatment could more or less be interpreted as this is a consequence of the treatment, because if it wasn't for that treatment, no one would be using it. But that's an extreme situation that would help you. Usually it's not that easy, because if people sell it, if it's available, if the supply is available, it's because some people are using it. But if you can say something about how frequently used are these technologies, that can also help knowing whether you still have better chances of capturing and being able to tell a bit more about adoption driven by the treatment. Thanks.
Hambulo, do you want to react to Karen and Rashid's comments?
Sure. Thank you very much. Thank you, Karen, and thank you, Rashid, for these very interesting observations. Indeed, for any impact assessment, you kind of start from some background, thinking about what kind of instruments will be relevant and things like that. And we went through that process, and like I mentioned earlier on, yeah, we have some candidate IVs that we can use. But again, like I mentioned, most of those are based on the social capital and information variables. Karen, you raised the issue about the counterfactual for the mother. Yeah, of course, that's always a challenge when you think about the counterfactual. So, I mean, a perfect counterfactual, I think you alluded to that, would be, and also Rashid, would be if you can find a perfect control. I mean, if I'm not here now talking to you people in this webinar, what would I be doing? And if you can find someone who is like me in every other respect, and then that would be a good counterfactual. And of course, identifying that is not a trivial task. And for the mothers, I know that would be a challenge. But again, if you think about it, I mean, the only distinction between mother horse and babies is that mother horse have quite a number of plots that are supported by the project. But again, that's not all the plots they have. They have a lot of other plots again. So hopefully, and this now touches on the point raised by Ricardo, like for the other farmers, are we seeing these more as spillovers or the controls? I think it's more the latter. It's more thinking of them more as controls, because I mean, 10 to 20 Ks, like you said, is not a very short distance. But I think for purposes of also trying to look at diffusion, I think you can argue that those that are probably within probably 10, 15 Ks is a high likelihood that they might have had a chance to be exposed to activities at the mother trial. Remember, mother trials also host field days where farmers are invited from quite a number of places. So in that respect, again, you can think of 10 to 20 kilometers as being a plausible distance within which some exposure to the mother trial might have happened. Karen, your point about outcomes, I think this is, to be honest, that is true. But you know, we're working in these research for development projects that have set development outcomes and objectives. So probably it's thinking about, when we do this kind of work, to what extent can we contribute to some of those? And I know, of course, attribution is a big issue and a challenging one to nail down, but your point is very much well taken. Yeah. And then coming to Ricardo, I think you mentioned the issue about the baseline and whether the baseline, the current survey can. Ricardo, are you saying something? Oh, sorry. My apologies.
The issue is they both show up as RL in Teams, and so we need one of them to change how their Teams thing shows up. It's very confusing to me as well.
Okay.
Yeah. my apologies, Rashid. My apologies.
Yeah.
My apologies. Yeah. So, to be honest, I haven't looked yet at the baseline data to that extent to see whether some of the farmers that were captured in the baseline were actually captured in our survey as well, which, like you say, would be a good thing. But I think the probability of that happening is not zero, because these surveys were done in places that are overlapping. And so I think that I might have to check again. And actually, I plan to do that fairly soon. So it's something that is on my to-do list. It's been on my to-do list for quite a bit. I think I touched a little bit about your question on the sampling frame. The technologies, are these new technologies? Good question. You know, there is, how do you say it? I'm not an agronomist, but I think what is novel about these particular technologies is the manner in which they are bundled and the manner in which they are promoted. So it could be the same things that have been there before, but the combinations they take are, I think, quite novel, in the sense that they can be said to be quite unique. But are they new 100%? No. And of course, it would be very difficult for us to attribute what we see outside of the host farmers to be a result of CIFAS. But then, you know, we have also questions in the survey about support received from not just the CIFAS project, but also other projects. So probably the idea would be just to say something about what is happening beyond the confines of the host of the trial host farmers, but not necessarily to attribute whatever we see out there to be as a result of the project. Those would be my thoughts for now.
Thanks. We only have 3 minutes left, so I propose to go to Sujata.
Okay, so this is going to come a little bit from sort of left field, but I'm thinking, you know, I had not quite realized that the program had already been rolled out even before you did your first survey. So I think the point that Rashid is making about not really having a baseline effectively is something that is probably going to be a big concern. I was just wondering if, you know, Kyle was saying, which is if you go back up and you find out where did they decide to run these trials, which villages did they decide to run these trials, whether you could kind of change your strategy a little bit and say, we're just going to say that this entire village has been treated in some way if the program is being run there. And, you know, then who gets to do it and whether it spreads within the village or not, all of that turns out to be endogenous. There's not much we can do now. But if there are other villages that are, for whatever reason, they decided not to go there, and you're going to have to figure out why they didn't go there, obviously, and make the point that that's exogenous. But then you can kind of do a different sort of study where you're saying, what's the effect in this village of running this versus, you know, a village where this program is not introduced at all. And then you're looking at more aggregate outcomes about adoption and things like that, and not necessarily farmer level. Just a thought. That's all I have.
Okay, I think that's perfect. I think some of those, you know, that's good food for thought, I guess you could say. Does anybody have any last things before we wrap up? Okay, Ricardo, Karen, any announcements to make, or we just go ahead and sign off?
No announcements.
Okay, very good. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for joining. This was fun and really informative. Thanks to Hambulo for the interesting presentation. Thanks, Sujata, for the discussion.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.